For 200 years, families in certain Appalachian hollows lived so cut off from the outside world that their family trees started folding back on themselves. Modern DNA tests show some descendants carry massive blocks of identical genetic code inherited from both parents. The isolation squeezed the gene pool so tightly that rare traits like blue skin and unexplained tremors surfaced out of nowhere. This genetic compression happened 10 times faster than scientists ever thought possible. A narrow road runs through Breathitt County, Kentucky. It follows the bends of Troublesome Creek. From the highway, the valley looks completely normal. Pickup trucks park under trees. Gravel driveways lead to wood porches facing the water. The hills around these homes rise sharply. Ridges block the horizon in almost every direction. Creeks keep cutting the valleys the same way they did a century ago. Places like this appear across eastern Kentucky, stretching down into parts of Tennessee and West Virginia. Before the 1940s, many of these narrow roads barely existed. Travel between valleys meant walking across steep, heavily forested ridges. A trip to the nearest town could take hours. State records show some hollows had no paved access until the mid-20th century. That geography created a natural genetic trap. Families built farms along the creeks and stayed in the same valleys for generations. Children grew up together and married neighbors. Mining records from the early 1900s show many workers in those counties lived within a few miles of their parents. Coal camps and small farms tied families to the same narrow valleys. Moving away was incredibly rare, so marriages often happened between people already connected through distant relatives. At first, the connections looked like normal second or third cousins. That is common in small rural places. When a new community starts with only a few people, their genes shape the entire future population. Medical researchers found that some hollows around Troublesome Creek held fewer than 10 unrelated bloodlines. Those founding families multiplied over 2 centuries. But the gene pool never widened. Instead of branching outward, the family trees looped back. The same ancestors appeared again and again in later generations. Genealogists call this pedigree collapse. In population genetics, scientists measure how closely related parents are using an inbreeding coefficient. In large cities, this number stays very low, but DNA testing from the 2000s showed something deeper in these mountains. Some Appalachian family lines carried coefficients around 0.2. For comparison, first cousins equals 0.0625. A number around 0.2 means the shared ancestry is much closer. It matches the highest levels ever recorded in European royal families. Researchers ran genetic tests from several Appalachian hollows using a program called Hereditas. The software reads DNA and builds family trees automatically. When samples from Letcher County entered the system, the computer flagged the results in red. The algorithm assumed the data was broken. It showed ancestors appearing as both grandparent and parent to the same child. The software marked the probability numbers as astronomically low. The program also measured runs of homozygosity. This concept means long stretches where both chromosomes carry the exact same sequence. Short stretches happen in every human population, but the samples from eastern Kentucky showed enormous blocks, matching from end to end. Some stretches covered tens of millions of DNA letters in a row. The scientists thought the machines were misreading the lab samples. They cleaned the equipment and ran the tests again. The second run produced the exact same twisted family structures. They ran the samples a third time, and the patterns held. The data forced the team to slow down. The massive blocks of identical DNA told a story about family lines staying extremely close. Instead of breaking apart through normal mixing, the genetic blocks stacked on top of each other. Every generation added another layer of identical segments. Some individuals showed around 30% of their genome in homozygous form. That level of overlap is almost impossible to find in modern mainland populations. Imagine a book with 100 pages. Now imagine 30 pages repeating the exact same paragraph over and over. The Appalachian hollows worked like a genetic echo chamber. Inherited traits circulated through the same small group repeatedly. Standard models suggested isolated communities might lose 1 or 2% of genetic diversity each generation. The hollow data showed diversity dropping 5 to 10% per generation instead. Rare recessive genes could appear in only 4 or 5 generations. Every 2 generations, the overall diversity cut almost in half. The mountain terrain created isolation stronger than many island communities. That small breeding population caused the DNA to compress rapidly. Researchers studying these patterns said the speed forced them to rethink old scientific models. The standard Wright-Fisher model predicted a slow loss of genetic diversity, but the hollow data showed something closer to compression. They began calling these new patterns hollow models. Instead of assuming slow drift across centuries, the hollow model treated the population like a tight genetic funnel. Genes entering that funnel spread incredibly fast. Scientists comparing these patterns noticed something unusual. The famous case of Pingelap Island in the Pacific showed strong genetic drift after a typhoon reduced the population. That event created color blindness in a large portion of the island. But even that island population still had trade and contact with nearby islands. The Appalachian hollows sometimes had even tighter isolation. A single road in and one road out. Every human carries thousands of inherited genetic traits. Many stay hidden because they only activate when a person receives the same rare gene from both parents. In large cities, those matching pairs rarely meet. In tight mountain networks, carriers live near each other. When 2 carriers marry, the hidden gene surfaces fully. The Appalachian data shows this happening multiple times across 7 generations. The genetic load increased sharply. The scale matches what population models predict when migration drops close to 0. In simple terms, the mountains allowed the math to play out in real life. Studies examining Appalachian DNA found stretches of repeated genes so large they resembled patterns normally seen only in theoretical extinction models. Those models describe populations so small their gene pools collapse inward. Yet the communities in eastern Kentucky never disappeared. Medical researchers continue studying rare disease genetics in Appalachian families today. The most visible example began in the early 1800s with Martin Fugate. He settled near Troublesome Creek. One rare gene moved quietly through his bloodline for decades. It affected hemoglobin, the molecule that carries oxygen through the body. A small chemical change darkened the blood and turned skin a slate blue tone. The condition is known as methemoglobinemia. Over generations, the recessive gene kept pairing with itself. One of the most famous moments tied to that history happened in 1975. A baby named Benjamin Stacy was born in Kentucky with deep blue skin. Doctors at the University of Kentucky Medical Center first suspected oxygen failure. The child's breathing stayed strong. Then a family member mentioned the Fugates of Troublesome Creek. Hospital staff traced the story back through the valley's deep history. Tests showed elevated levels of methemoglobin in the newborn's blood. Doctors treated the condition with methylene blue, a compound that converts methemoglobin back into normal hemoglobin. The baby's skin slowly returned to pink. Medical teams recognized the case as one of the last clear examples of the rare genetic pattern tied to that mountain family. The deeper story was about what long isolation does to human genetics. Neighbors in the mountains saw the blue skin so often that it stopped shocking anyone. People simply called them the blue Fugates, but other unusual traits appeared quietly across the broader region. Medical teams examining extended lines documented conditions affecting how the body handled food proteins. 16 distinct conditions appeared in the dataset that doctors had rarely seen before. Some children developed severe neurological shaking that slowly worsened over time. Other families showed unusual uneven bone growth patterns. Limbs developed at different rates. Some birth defect rates reached 1 in 8 children inside certain family clusters. The usual rate in larger populations sits closer to 1 in 10,000. researchers noticed specific hollows developed their own distinct inherited conditions. Valleys had patterns entirely absent from neighboring communities just 5 miles away. The Shelton families in some valleys carried one set of traits. Hancock lines carried entirely different conditions. Because marriages repeated between the same groups, the rare mutations kept stacking. This compression created an unusual problem for the scientists studying it. The anonymized DNA samples generated what one researcher called shadows of crimes. The data showed relationships that normally remain strictly private. The researchers faced a strange situation because the records pointed to acts that would be illegal in modern law. Anonymity rules meant no one could connect the tangled family loops to specific names or places. The teams focused solely on how the genes behaved inside the compressed networks. The scale of the compression surprised everyone involved in the studies. 200 years of isolation squeezed the lines incredibly tight. This genetic compression spread far beyond eastern Kentucky. Highway 31 bends through the hills of Hancock County, Tennessee, near Sneedville. The town rests between Clinch Mountain and Powell Mountain. About 15 founding families helped form much of the population in these isolated hollows. Their descendants show unusually high levels of homozygosity. Consumer DNA tests keep revealing homozygosity numbers between 20 and 30% right now. Isolation worked like a slow seal over Sneedville. It preserved rare genetic markers that disappeared almost everywhere else. Some men carry a Y DNA type called E1B1b, which globally appears most often around the Mediterranean and North Africa. Another pattern resembles the Cohen-Modal haplotype. The maternal lines tell a similar story, holding rare mitochondrial markers seen almost nowhere else in North America. The mountains blocked outside migration completely. Another researcher named Dr. Hicks examined a specific case from 1989. The sample came from a family connected to the Melangione communities of the mountains. The DNA results showed elevated endogamy. This means repeated marriage within a highly tight group. He ran the test 3 times, and each run produced the same massive stretches of identical genes. The markers stayed preserved in the exact same valleys. Fiddles and banjos still play together in these communities today, blending European melodies with rhythms from older traditions. Wild ramps still grow in the shaded mountain forests every spring. Life in places like Sneedville moved just like any small Appalachian town. Families gathered at churches and worked in small farms or nearby coal mines. The deeper genetic history stayed completely invisible underneath the daily routine. The physical traits eventually forced attention. Family records from some Appalachian lines mention polydactyly. Children were born with 6 fingers or 6 toes. The trait appears across multiple generations in certain mountain families. Doctors studying some descendants also reported patterns of heart defects appearing more frequently than expected. In a few family clusters, records suggest heart defects occurring in roughly 1 out of 8 births. Some descendants also show conditions linked to familial Mediterranean fever. The illness causes periodic inflammation attacks in the body. It is rare across most of North America, yet traces appear clearly among certain Appalachian family lines. Geneticists studying these communities explain that the recessive genes surface more easily because the descendants continued marrying inside the same network. Some researchers describe the effect as genetic debt. Each generation quietly carries hidden recessive traits. They stay invisible for years, then 2 carriers meet. The hidden gene finally surfaces. The result appears as rare medical conditions that seem to arrive completely out of nowhere. The DNA analysis exposes how widespread that pattern became in the hollows. The pattern only began to break when highways improved across eastern Kentucky in the mid-20th century. Young people left the hollows for jobs in larger cities. They met partners from outside the tight family circles. The closed gene pools slowly began opening. Rare mutations spread into much larger populations, heavily reducing the chance of 2 carriers meeting. The unusual medical conditions began appearing less often. Descendants still send in DNA tests every year. The results come back with massive runs of identical DNA. The reports flag carrier status for rare recessive conditions. The digital family trees start connecting the surnames and county records straight back to Hancock County grave markers. The discovery often surprises descendants whose lives are now far removed from those valleys. Doctors sometimes recommend genetic testing for families with known connections to isolated mountain populations. The goal is simple. They want to identify hidden carriers before rare conditions appear in children. The story is not about one specific family line. It is about an entire system of valleys, ridges, and hollows that shaped human genetics for nearly 200 years. Scientists spend decades building computer models to predict how genes behave in tiny populations. Eastern Kentucky gave them a real-world version running quietly for 2 centuries. Space agencies now use the Appalachian hollow data to model how colonies on other planets might evolve if isolated for long periods. It remains one of the clearest examples of how fast human DNA shifts when a population stays extremely small. Drive through Hazard or Sneedville today, and the streets look completely ordinary. Families still live on the exact land where their ancestors settled. Nothing on the surface hints at the massive chains of matching chromosomes stacked inside the bloodlines. But the genetic record continues carrying through those families today.